Evolution is wrong. The kind of evolution that you think, that we think is right, is absolutely wrong. Now I'm going to say this once, and hopefully it will sink in. I do not believe that my grandparents are apes. Now, whenever a creationist says this, I'm never sure whether to laugh or to cry, because the ignorance of this statement is just astounding. The theory of evolution, or more specifically of human evolution, is that we have common ancestors with apes. This is definitely not the same thing as my grandmother or grandfather being an ape. There is an absolutely massive difference in timescales. Okay, I'm going to say something a little bit controversial here, in that we have approximately 97% of our DNA in common with chimpanzees. Does this mean that we're long-lost brothers? It really doesn't. Speciation, i.e. the point where we became different species, is believed to have happened many, many years ago. But the fact is that the evolution of Homo sapiens, i.e. us, still has massive gaps in it. Now, some of you might expect me to become uncomfortable at this point, because I just admitted that there are quite large gaps in the theory of evolution. Of course I'm not uncomfortable with this. There are bound to be huge gaps in the timeline of human evolution, because, well, we're at the end point, and the beginning happened quite a while ago. The fact is, evolution can be demonstrated at hundreds of different points. It's really self-evident. For instance, you can breed dogs to give dogs that are absolutely different by selecting dogs with characteristics and then having those genes passed on. And selective breeding has been going on, well, for a rather long time, because even old age farmers would select the best animals to breed with each other because they were aware that they would produce the best offspring. Genetic variation is self-evident, and genetic variation is at the very roots of evolution. Now, if you deny genetic variation, then really you're so blindly ignorant that there's not really much chance of reaching you anyway. So I'm going to assume that you do accept genetic variation, because otherwise I might as well just stop the video now. From here it really becomes a game of probabilities. So when you have more or less identical organisms, the chances of each of them surviving to pass on their genes is more or less equal. Then one of these organisms has a mutation which changes its genome. Now, if this mutation then increases the chances that this organism will survive until it reproduces, then effectively what you've done is increase the chances that this mutation will be carried on. Now, because this is a game of chance, these mutations which infer survival characteristics are not always passed on. In fact, the chances of these mutations being passed on due to the organism containing these mutations reproducing is only very slightly higher than any other organism of the same species. But evolution is about the cumulative effect of these mutations. Now, to provide you with a very simplified version of evolution, commonly known as microevolution, I'm going to demonstrate to you some evolution in bacteria. So let's see. Bacteria divide by meiosis, which means that one bacteria becomes 2, becomes 4, becomes 8. Basically, power 2, times it by 2 every time. Now, because their nucleus doesn't have a membrane, when they divide, it's actually quite often that you get them dividing into uneven parts, and you get quite common mutations occurring. So for instance, if the genes line up wrong, if the chromosomes line up wrong, then you'll get quite significant variation. And this can mean that the new bacteria cell is completely flawed and can't work, or it can mean that it changes in some respects. So, if you infer a survivalistic trait onto these bacteria due to a mutation, so for instance, if one of these bacteria cells became resistant to an antibacterial drug, then these bacterial cells would in essence survive nuking. When I say nuke, I'm obviously referring to if you use antibacterial drugs, and the bacteria that survive these are going to have the resistance to this drug. This means that effectively all of the other bacteria will have died, and the bacteria with the mutation, and this can be quite a small mutation, that allowed it to survive will carry on passing its mutation, and this is how you get super diseases and super bacteria who are resistant to many kinds of drugs, because before we really knew what we were doing, we pumped drugs into people to try and cure diseases without realizing that the bacteria was becoming resistant to them. Now, this isn't quite evolution, because evolution relies on natural selection and chance, whereas this relies on genetic variation and the fact that if you kill everything that doesn't have this, the only surviving will be something that does have this, and then it will pass it on. But it's got the same concept, except instead of split into multiple stages, it's been split into one stage. Also, instead of being split into the probability of an organism surviving being slightly higher than the rest of the organisms, it's been changed into, if the organism does not have this mutation, it will almost definitely die. Nevertheless, this form of evolution is still valid. It merely uses the fact that bacteria reproduce very rapidly, and that variation in bacteria is very high, to highlight evolution. I mean, if humans had significant genetic variation from generation to generation, to the same level that the bacteria did, i.e. a huge change in the genome, which we obviously don't, otherwise we could change into an ape from species to species, and that isn't what evolution is about. And we had generations that can be as little as 20 minutes long, then you could get the human race evolving over a day. But obviously our generations aren't as little as 20 minutes long, and you can't vary our genome by 3% in one generation. In fact, almost every human on the planet only has a few only has a few tiny differences in our genome. Anyways, this was a video trying to demonstrate that I do not believe that my grandparents are apes, and that evolution is a tiny little bit more complicated than creationists tend to say it is. I drifted slightly from what I was trying to do. I ended up going into a lot more detail than I was planning on doing so, but I don't really see much of a problem with that. I might be wrong on some points. I put a little bit of research into this, but I didn't spend hours on it, which I'm sure you can probably tell. Anyway, catch you guys later. Try to keep the flaming to a... What am I kidding? I love flaming. See you guys later.